Welcome everyone to MedTech Easy's podcast. My name's Harmina and I'm the medical representative at MTE.
Hi, my name is Ravant and I'm the founder and president of OSCEASY, the overarching organization.
I'm delighted to welcome a very special guest today, Dafydd Loughran, a urologist by training and also CEO of Concentric Health. So thank you so much, Dafydd, for coming on to the podcast today. We're super excited to learn about what you do and also just your journey to where you got to. So how about we start off with a more in-depth introduction, and maybe you could tell us a little bit more about Concentric Health.
Thanks so much, and great to join you both today. Yeah, so I'm Dav, as you say, a surgeon by training, very much still a clinician at heart. And my journey has been a kind of, I often say it's lots and lots of little tiny steps. So the first thing to say, and I'm super clear on this, and I kind of increasingly lent into it, is that I'm not a classical like entrepreneur, big kind of extroverted individual who is, totally comfortable doing, big bold things, podcasts, and all of this kind of stuff. It's I'm much more comfortable, building products, thinking about problems. That's kind of where I am. But yeah, so my journey. So I was a Cardiff mentioned, just like Ravant is currently, and was definitely not doing anything in terms of innovation during med school. So this was not kind of a path that I had kind of started carving in any way, shape or form during med school. So I played tennis. I was kind of Cardiff Uni, like first team captain for tennis. Like tennis was what I did outside of med school. But from a reasonably kind of techie family. So once I started as a foundation doctor, so I did my training in Wales. So once I started as a foundation doctor, I naturally found myself like tinkering with things, right? There was lots of, an unimaginable number of little things that niggle you or annoy you, day to day on the wards that you think, is there a simple solution to that, or is there something I could do? And so I ended up playing around with lots of different things. I ended up going to things like NHS hack days and just playing, right? Just playing and thinking like, what could you do? And one of those things was like an aid memoir platform that I started building for my own use from a consent perspective. And the story there was basically that I went as an F2 doctor up to North Wales, did an orthopedic job, and the first day of that job was basically told, right, your job on this firm is to basically consent to the patients for operations. And I just kind of remember on that first Wednesday morning thinking, crikey, I did 2 weeks of orthopedics in med school. Like, I am no better place to be having consent conversations with these patients than they are. They probably know far more about their conditions than I do. So that was, in its simplest form, the starting point here, where I said, well, I feel a bit uncomfortable with that position. I want to not feel uncomfortable having those conversations. So I want to make sure that I am, prepped across my brief in terms of like what I should know for those conversations. Started building an aid memoir for my own use, so that if someone asked me, right, have a consent conversation with someone about an IM, tibial nail, or whatever it was, I had a little resource that I could go to, spend 2 minutes just getting my head in that mindset, know the important things to discuss in terms of complications, that kind of stuff, frequently asked questions type of things from patients, so that I could then go into those conversations and, feel much more comfortable about my position in supporting that conversation. And it was one of those funny ones where, so that, there was totally and utterly no business plan there. There was no intention for it to be anything more than me solving a little kind of discomfort that I had myself. But it was at the time, so it's probably kind of feels a bit foreign to both of you guys. So back then in sort of 2012, 2013, actually it was really still pretty unusual to have mobile phones on the ward. There had just been the kind of first move of things like having the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine available online, but that was still really super new. So most people were still carrying around, the old kind of stethoscope, OHCM, well, lab coats had gone, but it was still around that time. And so we would basically have the conversation. I had lots of people come up to me and say, oh, what are you doing with your phone out on the ward, and why, I've asked you to go and speak to this patient about, this thing, like, why are you looking at your phone? And so that basically started some conversations to say, well, I've got this, thing that I've been building, and actually I've gone from job to job and built some resources around, things I need to discuss for ENT and then orthopedics, and then, kind of built around. And that just totally organically grew some users that, junior doctors, SHOs, registrars would be like, oh, that's kind of useful. That's interesting. Could either we use that, or could I kind of add some content on that for my juniors? And it kind of built from there. And that was just enough that that clinical community was of people doing, different things was so small at that time. So, whereas now you've got the whole kind of army of clinical entrepreneurs, like that just like totally didn't exist 10 years ago. There was, you were a total weirdo if you were thinking of doing something that wasn't kind of clinical training. We'd started to get to the point where people were starting to go to Australia for kind of a year or two, but that was the kind of extent of thinking about doing something different post F2. But yeah, so that community was so small at that time that even if you were doing something teeny tiny like that was, you ended up getting asked to like go to, doctorpreneurs events and pitches and stuff. So I had a few experiences during those first couple of years, which were totally different to what I was doing in my kind of foundation training and my kind of SHO years, that was just enough to make me think, I wonder if there's something interesting about doing a kind of a different pathway. So I was, as I said, I'm not the kind of extroverted, big, bold entrepreneur. So I wasn't brave enough to go and say, okay, I'm gonna be an entrepreneur. I'm gonna do, this like thing. But I was convinced enough that I wanted to explore, that I looked for a sidestep to kind of have some space to explore. And one of the options for that for me post core surgical training was to do a leadership fellowship. So one of the kind of FMLM leadership fellows, and that gave me a huge amount of space. So I remember first conversation in that year, where I kind of had a project that had been set out for me for that year, but had a coffee with my education supervisor for that year. And I just remember him saying, at the end of that conversation, I'm just kind of curious, let's almost park that project that was planned. Let's see what your brain does with a kind of year of bit more space, and just like see where it goes. So that was, for me, an unbelievably fortunate like opportunity. You just don't have that kind of space and time and flexibility to be able for someone to say, right, here's kind of a year to go and play and explore. So I used that opportunity to do lots of different things. So I spent some time doing quality improvement projects, like within a health board, within a trust. Got involved in some informatics within Wales, but then actually also spent a few kind of blocks of time at different health tech startups kind of in the UK. And off the back of that, got a role at Babylon. So probably a kind of reasonable number of listeners will kind of know Babylon's story. So Babylon being a kind of, a primary care provider, telemedicine, was kind of the first one to make a big wave in the UK, certainly around remote GPs, and also the kind of chatbot side of that. So I went into Babylon kind of reasonably early on. So Babylon was about 80 people, and I was there for 2 years. And in that time, we grew to 800 people. So saw that organization going from, kind of a startup, certainly an organization where everyone knew each other, to now an organization and all the challenges that brought. And, I will often say, Babylon was always a controversial place to work, was a kind of challenging place in many ways for a clinician to work. But the learning from that period there for me going forward in terms of career was just huge, and gave me much more I think, maturity around what I believed in terms of the like balance between like clinical stuff, commercial stuff, like where did I fit on that pathway. Babylon clearly, a reasonably commercial organization, and there were lots of challenges around how it was perceived within the clinical community, and just being within that tent makes you work out your standpoint on that sort of stuff. So I kind of went and did that, and I think going to Babylon was one of those examples of an opportunity that came my way, and again, it wasn't kind of intentional. It wasn't the thing that I said right after my kind of fellowship year, like that's what I'm going to do. But I was probably just about brave enough to go and say, okay, maybe I allow myself to go through that door. But then we kind of come kind of full circle back to Concentric as it then became. So consent and shared decision making and the kind of process of consent was one of these things that we kept coming back to, and kept looking and say, well, no one's really like solved that. We're seeing all the kind of move to EPRs and EPRs, EHRs, but basically everyone's still got like paper consent forms. We still know that loads of junior doctors are having like really like tricky conversations around consent where I'm not convinced they're adding value and all this kind of stuff. And so we kept coming back to this idea, and it was one of those like side projects that never quite went away, never quite came to anything for a long time, but never quite went away. And we applied for like grants. Again, we weren't brave enough to go and say, right, we're gonna go and do this, and we're gonna not have a salary for a year, and we're gonna try and make it work. We just weren't those individuals. But so we went for some grants, didn't get them. Interesting little kind of tidbit of like resilience for me of the story was that we applied for 2 Innovate UK grants and didn't get them. And then we applied for a third one, which actually was a kind of a bigger pot of money. And initially we had a response from them saying, oh, you've this is a repeat application. You've applied with this twice before. And so I remember kind of going through this process with Innovate saying, oh, it's it's different, it's got this bit that's different, it's got this bit that's a bit bigger. Like I remember like a bit of toing and froing, getting them to say, okay, we'll accept it, like we'll allow you to apply. And then actually that was the one that landed. And I remember one Friday evening, like 5:30 in October 2018, having an email from Innovate UK saying, yeah, there's £500,000 grant to go and make this thing like a real thing. And like that was that grant that we weren't going to be allowed to apply for, and we kind of hustled a bit to get them to allow it through the gates. And so that was a total moment. It was a very like speculative grant. We kind of didn't think it would happen, and so when that email came, we were suddenly like, oh crikey, right, like we now have to like work out like what does that like mean. Suddenly that's a real thing. And so we started the project as it properly was in January 2019. I had about kind of 15-16 months of getting to first clinical use. So first clinical use was then at Imperial, March 2020, literally first week of wave 1 of COVID, trying to get this thing over the line. And again, this is total like timing and luck and all that stuff. So I'm pretty sure that if we hadn't got that kind of first clinical use of Concentric within that week, then it was totally being shelved for the foreseeable future as kind of COVID cracked on. So we could see this really visible deadline of like lockdown like coming closer, and like the speed things changed within those week or two. We were like, we need to get over the line, we need to get first clinical use like today, otherwise it just doesn't happen. And then project time would have run out. We'd have like kind of whether we'd have ever got things over the line is definitely up for debate. So then like first clinical use of Concentric. So Concentric, let's just kind of cover slightly what Concentric is. So Concentric in its simplest form is taking those paper consent forms for treatment. So any kind of consent form 1, 2, 4, those things before any operation, procedure, treatment, And its simplest way of thinking about it is a digital version of that. But in reality, it's a kind of transformation of that process, because we shift quite a lot of that, information sharing outside of consultation time. We see lots of remote consent. We see kind of leveraging lots of other resources, so kind of videos, animations, those kind of stuff, to a point where actually the data we have now around impacting like shared decision making quality and how informed patients are is pretty convincing, actually. But kind of fast forward over the next couple of years, we had like a handful of pilot sites, unpaid pilots. That was the kind of approach we took for about 18 months. And then again, we're super fortunate, timing is so huge in so many of these pathways, in terms of businesses. So just at the point where the product was getting to a point where it was kind of mature enough that it wasn't totally, held together by super glue, there was a big, decent pot of elective recovery funding. So, we all kind of know the challenges in terms of waiting lists. And so there was funding, of which digital consent and pre-op assessment platforms were like highlighted as one of the key things that could support elective recovery. And so, we were at that point where we were just about ready enough to basically go to places and say, yeah, we can actually deliver on this stuff. So that really accelerated things for us. We closed kind of 20 trust-wide contracts in 3 months with that funding, to a point where now we're rolled out with Concentric across about like 30 or so NHS trusts, mainly in the UK, a little kind of smattering of use elsewhere globally, but very much mainly in the UK, mainly in England within that. But thousands of patients per week going through the platform right across all different specialties.
Thank you so much, Daf, for that wonderful brief. I think it's really interesting to learn the whole journey. It gives a lot of hope for students who haven't really ventured or dipped their feet in medical technology, or just venturing out to do something else different. It gives them hope to see your journey and how you have developed and been so successful as it is. Now, the one thing that I think many people, including me, have in the back of my mind is that the reason why we become, or we take medicine as a career and we become doctors and stuff, is because of the interest of clinical knowledge. How exactly are you able to manage both the clinical knowledge as well as managing a whole organization and all the stuff that encompasses while training and simultaneously managing other commitments in your life as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. And so it's probably worth touching in terms of like my North Star around like why I'm doing this and not what would have otherwise have been my pathway. So I'd basically at the age now where most of my surgical friends are kind of CCTing, so just kind of moving into consultant. So it becomes much more clear to me in terms of like which pathway should I be going, and what should I be doing longer term, is can I have more impact doing this than I would as a consultant surgeon? And the balance is interesting, right? So I have much less impact per patient, but I can do that at much more scale. And we have some calculations internally and kind of my own calculations around what I think that kind of impact equation looks like. And so at this point, we're certainly bypassing the point of me having more impact, I think, than I would be having on healthcare as a kind of individual consultant surgeon. And I think the interesting part of that for me as a kind of as a CEO and running a business is that we're not a million miles away from the point that I can say that each person in the team, whether they're clinically trained or not, is having as much of an impact as if each of those was a consultant surgeon. So that's kind of it's what I will use as my kind of North Star to justify, like, am I having more impact doing this, or should I actually be back in training and kind of becoming a consultant surgeon? But yeah, the question around clinical kind of training, so it's probably worth just kind of stating, so I'm still GMC registered, so I still go through like an appraisal process, I still revalidate, but I essentially do that within the scope of my work. So that is within like clinical informatics, so I don't see patients face to face, but I still have CPD, kind of continuous professional development requirements around clinical content, so the content that is being used by clinicians, but also things that are really important in the space of clinical safety, like digital clinical safety. So it is really important for me as a clinician to understand the context clinically that these products are used in, can work with deploying teams to understand what are the risks, what are the benefits, what are some of the risks in that context of a deploying organization who will often have different setups and all that kind of stuff. And so I appraise, I kind of revalidate, I go through that GMC process within that scope of work, which is, I think just a useful thing to highlight in this kind of conversation, just because it's a bit of a hidden pathway for most people, even when they're getting into kind of health tech. But yeah, in terms of that balance, so certainly I wrote a huge amount of this content for a long time. I now have kind of content team who kind of support that, and then most of that sort of comes through me, just because I have a lot of knowledge of context of what's gone before in terms of this like ontology, this structured graph of knowledge. But I write less content definitely than I used to. But that balance of clinical knowledge, I've often said that I think clinically more doing Concentric than I did as a junior doctor, because it might be more, it might be about the same, but it's certainly not a huge amount less. And I think you just replace the other bits with different stuff. So as an F1, you're thinking clinically a bit of time, and you're doing a load of process stuff. You're doing a load of admin. You're doing a load of discharge letters, whatever that is. And lots of that is not really kind of stretching or making you think clinically. And in the same way, with my kind of business hat on, there's a certain amount of my time that I'm thinking clinically and thinking deeply clinically, either in terms of like actual clinical like knowledge or clinical pathways. And then there's the other bit of it, which is the kind of admin-y bit, which is running a business, finances, all of that other stuff. So the balance is almost kind of similar in terms of clinical. It's just filled with different stuff on the other side.
So I just had a quick follow-up question. So in that case, when you're curating more of data and sort of articles and things writing, do you at all miss the patient contact and the surgical aspect of things that you used to do before then?
Yeah, so I think it's different, right? So I think there are some times where you think, so my wife's in anesthetics kind of ST5, so I'm still kind of you still hear the stories, you still kind of come back after a long day and kind of hear the stories, and there are occasions where you think, oh, that sounds kind of in a perverse way like cool. Often it's like the big stuff that sounds like interesting to have been part of. And as a surgical trainee, as a urology reg, there are definitely some amazing peaks, right? There are some things that you've like stretched yourself, you've like done an operation that you've watched others do for a few years, and then you've kind of done it for the yourself for the first time, and those are like wonderful like endorphin rushes. And so you definitely get those big peaks, but there are also some horrendous lows, right? So there's some stuff where you've made a mistake or kind of not noticed something, or it kind of wasn't your fault, but you kind of in hindsight think, well, could we have done X or Y? And so those are kind of lows, as well as just the pure lows of rotas and being I was 10 years ago we were doing kind of stretches of 7 nights in a row, and going in for your 5th night shift, and you're just like, oh, like I just couldn't feel any worse, right? So I would say that my kind of day-to-day now has less of those like huge rushes and huge lows. There's still like peaks and troughs, right? There's like moments where you win a tender or that kind of stuff that feel good, but I wouldn't say that they're quite the same endorphin like rushes of in inverted commas saving a life. It's not usually that, right? But it's in populist media it would be that. but I don't, you know, I don't actively, you know, very often go and say, oh, I really miss that kind of patient contact. And I think that is, for me, is that I can always come back to that kind of North Star of impact to say, yes, I know that I'm not as involved on an individual patient level in a huge way, but equally by now I wake up in the morning and like there's tens or hundreds of patients who have been like impacted by a product like before I even got out of bed, right? So they're just kind of different impacts. You just got to be comfortable with that, and you know, I know there's a huge move in terms of, you know, looking at different careers or kind of MedTech, and there's lots of, you know, discontent currently and strikes and all that stuff, but let's not take away those kind of amazing highs of clinical training as well. There's they are worth it in many cases.
So thank you for your insight. It's nice to hear your perspective, and that you still feel like you're making such a huge impact, and you evidently are, whilst you were both a trainee and currently with Concentric. So when you said on a day-to-day basis, like you don't always have those highs and lows, I guess that also comes down to the team you have around you. And I'm assuming at Concentric you have many different teams working on different things, and you have opinions from different team members. So how do you go about recruiting your team, and what is currently like the setup of Concentric?
Yeah, so we're still pretty small. You know, talking about that kind of Babylon growth of 80 to 800, you know, that was like what's sometimes called like blitz scaling, like growing really, really fast. You know, raising loads of money and like kind of chasing the big dream as you're kind of falling off a cliff type of approach. So Concentric, we've taken a more reserved approach. You know, we've been pretty small. We've almost bootstrapped. We took a kind of small angel investment round just kind of before some of the revenue came, but we've stayed pretty tight. So whilst, you know, we have these kind of 30 trusts using Concentric by now, as a team we're still kind of 6 people full-time, another kind of handful part-time in different roles. But yeah, this isn't kind of, you know, tens and tens of people full-time. And what that allows us to do, so one of the kind of concepts I quite like around, so Jeff Bezos talks, there's a few concepts that Bezos is kind of well known for introducing and really drumming at Amazon. So one of those is kind of 2 pizza teams. So the principle that a team functions best when it's kind of reasonably autonomous. It can kind of function without having too many external stakeholders that need to kind of bring in or be dependent on, and that team works most like functionally if you could have lunch and share 2 pizzas. Now these are American pizzas, so they're kind of bigger than a UK pizza, so generally that's kind of 4 to 6 people in a team that generally can function pretty independently. And sometimes you'd have, you know, a bit of flex of that, so someone will come in or, you know, in and out. But it generally, if you can think about like the, you know, building the thing that you're doing, or kind of deploying the thing, or developing the thing that you're developing within that team size or structure. So for example, at Amazon, you know, there's lots and lots of little microservices that each of them try and have a kind of setup of about 4 to 6 people who own that little bit. So, you know, there's that balance of growing and being able to have kind of enough within that team to, you know, deliver the things. And, you know, clearly as we've had more and more clinician users and patient users, there are kind of more demands of different things that we kind of, you know, are asked to do, and timeframes that we're kind of pushed to deliver. But also knowing that actually going from 6 people to 60 people does not mean that you have, you know, 10 times the output. It's definitely not that kind of linear trajectory. So you have to kind of pick where you are on that. And for me, probably impacted by that kind of Babylon experience of blitzscaling, we've kept that much tighter and saying actually we want to have like really good output per individual, and be kind of tight on those numbers. Whilst you know we're hiring a couple of developers currently, and we've brought, you know, a couple of clinicians in over the last couple of years. But it's not been like, we're not hiring someone per month type of thing.
I think that's really interesting, and I've seen a couple of case studies where organizations that are growing incredibly quickly, they take that into their stride, and they recruit accordingly, and they think that the output is going to match their recruitment process, and that's where something really goes wrong, and it just all collapses. So I think it's a really good positive that obviously you've analyzed your market and you've seen what's the best type of growth for you. Even if, say, 100 trusts want to come and give, you probably say, no, let us take it slowly, one at a time, so that it's being implemented in the right fashion and having the maximal output. So that being said, what were some of the problems that you encountered while trying to establish and grow this, apart from the funding and stuff? And how are you able to convince these trusts and these organizations to say, hey, look, taking this is going to make a huge difference in your clinical experience?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that probably the first thing to say is that you're always standing on the shoulders of others who've either gone before you, or kind of all work that you or others have done over the period of time. So I think we were definitely in many ways kind of lucky that we had spent basically kind of 2012, 2013 up to 2019 kind of chipping away, doing some thought leadership. People were kind of vaguely aware that we were doing stuff in consent, and we were kind of suggesting that there was going to be a move towards digital, and so it was probably a little bit less of a surprise when we kind of suddenly had some money to build a thing that was a thing. And there are always things that you leverage. So there are other products out there that have done kind of patient information in like PDFs or kind of paper, or the kind of digital versions of those patient information, and that's the kind of the predecessor really of Concentric as a an all-encompassing digital consent product, which is information and the documentation of consent and the integration into EPRs and all that stuff. So that kind of a drip feed of stuff coming in was definitely useful for us. The other thing that I am a huge advocate of is the transparency that and the kind of benefits of transparency that have been so much more than I thought they would be. So some of the examples, like there are certain kind of compliance things that you need to kind of demonstrate that you're compliant with, or things like our approach to clinical safety, a field that has generally been kind of hidden behind, once you get into a deployment, then an organization shares the clinical safety stuff because it has good things and bad things, right? It has things that you're saying, well, actually, I can help in this way, or there are safeguards in place for this and this, but as part of that clinical safety work, there's also an acknowledgement of actually this introduces risks in these ways and that kind of stuff. And so generally those sort of things have often sat behind organizational walls, and so we've been like totally transparent with all of that stuff. Actually, basically any document that we have and anything that we've kind of written is publicly available. It's like on our website. And so it was one of those, again, basically an accident, right? We were getting to that point in early 2022 where we'd signed a huge amount of lots and lots of contracts because of that funding. And so suddenly we were a tiny team, everything was basically coming through me. I had all of these kind of people wanting like access to like documents and stuff that were in our like Google Drive, and I was like, oh God, it just takes too long to like find the stuff, send it to you, tell you which like sheet to look at, and all this kind of stuff. And so I basically in that moment decided, right, I'm just going to put these online so that I can just ping people to URLs and they can just see them. I don't need to walk them through them, all that kind of stuff. And so that came out of like a kind of manual process challenge that I was like, well, I just want to shift this onto like publicly available. You can find it, you can explore. I can take that kind of 5 minutes out of my day for each of those requests. And then what I kind of realized from that was that being surprisingly transparent in that stuff was like 10x value. So suddenly it totally changed the conversations around, compliance, data protection, clinical safety, because just the fact that things were publicly available meant that clinicians were coming and saying, okay, yeah, I can engage with this. I'm not kind of fighting you to find out what you're kind of hiding. Totally changed the conversation, totally brought it more to kind of a par. And it wasn't an organization kind of saying, like pitch to us how this is safe. It was much more a conversation about like, okay, here's the state of play, here's like what that means in the context. And so yeah, that was just I've been continually surprised by the value on a kind of human conversation level of that transparency. Clearly there are some scenarios where, for whatever reasons, that's tricky for companies to get to. But if you're in a position where you can actually be public and share things, even if there are some things in there that some companies would be a bit uncomfortable about, I think if you're on that boundary of saying, actually, maybe we can be totally transparent, the value of doing that has been amazing for us.
And I guess because consent needs to be such a transparent process, it's really important that also Concentric's information and the way you work is also transparent. But were you ever worried at some stage that potentially other businesses or companies might see your ideas and see these publicly available documents and think, oh, we could do this, but do it better, or we could do this instead? Did you sort of have like IP in place and things like that?
Yeah, it's definitely, because all of those things that we made transparent will have taken us a lot of time to write and build and polish. So yeah, there's definitely an opportunity for others to come and say, well, actually, we can create these documents, create these resources for ourselves in 5 minutes, and it took Concentric a week to do. Totally possible. But frankly, I'm just not worried. So the first thing to say is that like competition is so valuable. So just and we all do it, right? We all, particularly early in the journey, you see kind of someone else doing something in the same space, and you're thinking, oh no, they're gonna do it. Like, there's no point. There have been so many of those people things. Some of them have been really bullish and come to us and say, oh yeah, we're going to do that, so you guys can probably kind of stop doing this because we're going to do it. And I definitely took that quite personally initially, and a tiny number of those ones have come to something. Most of them have totally not, and they've disappeared as quickly as they came. But the other thing in terms of competition is that you cannot create a product category without competition. So the most clear example of this for us is that NHSX, as it kind of was, could not early on in 2022 have put a funding pot for digital consent if there was only Concentric doing digital consent, because it would have been like, they couldn't have done that from a competition perspective. And so the fact that there were kind of 2 or 3 options on the market meant that they could do that. So firstly, that's a really obvious thing to say, like, we were so lucky to have some other competitors in a product space that allowed some of those opportunities to occur. And the other thing, it's the classic, if you haven't got competitors, like, is there a market? But also just the fact that it's kind of lonely if you're the only person like preaching a thing, if you're like on top of a hill like shouting this thing and like no one else is saying anything similar. It's pretty easy on a kind of personal human level to be like, am I totally insane? Like, why isn't anyone else saying this thing? And so if you do have a group of other companies who are saying similar stuff, or kind of often like nudging the messaging, so they might kind of go a little slightly different direction in messaging, and that kind of makes you think about things in different ways. And we all kind of look at other products doing different stuff and learn some stuff and like nudge our messaging, and sometimes that's to kind of meet that competition, but often most of the time it's because there's so many things you could be thinking about in any of these things, that there are often things that someone else does and you go, oh yeah, that's a good point. We'd never really thought about that. And sometimes that's from like competitors, other companies doing kind of parallel stuff. And sometimes it's from like trusts I've gone to some conferences and I see a poster from a team that have deployed Concentric, and so like one thing they've highlighted is some impact around, there's an example recently of a safeguarding team, like had a poster around some impact around safeguarding, because of visibility of consent form 4s. And it was just one of those things that we as a team had never even like thought about, never spoken to these safeguarding teams, but yeah, it was like the one thing that this deploying organization had highlighted as like a really big impact that they wanted to be shouting at. So yeah, so that's kind of a bit of a tangent, but competitors, whilst it's easy to worry about them, there are probably more pros than cons. And frankly, like building technology is hard, right? And copying technology is really hard too. So it would be unbelievably difficult for us to like change Concentric today into a like model of one of our competitors, because they're like fundamentally built differently. The pathways are different. Like, it would be so hard for us to do that, even if we thought they were doing something better. So even though it's hard sometimes to be like, to not worry, I would just say, just run with things. And even if someone's saying, as many have to me, oh, we're now doing that, so don't worry about it, take that with a pinch of salt, and B, still run with it. There will be things that you end up doing differently. There will be things that you learn along that journey. And so even if 2 years down the line you think, actually let's not run with this idea any further, you'll have still learned as part of that journey of getting to there.
Yeah, so I guess there's that sort of healthy competition, although these competitors and yourself, Concentric, are within the field of consent, you're all doing something slightly different. There's not going to be a consent duplicate or something like that. And I just also wanted to ask about COVID. So you mentioned earlier that although you'd been preparing sort of these documents and getting Concentric sort of off the ground for the past since like 2012, if you hadn't have got the first clinical use in within that week or so, or those days before lockdown struck, Concentric might not be where it is today. So are there any other ways that COVID has impacted you, both positively and negatively?
Yeah, so I think overall you would probably say that we were in the group of places that, in the group of products that COVID accelerated. So I think there's two parts to that really. So the first bit was the pure thing of, in those first few months, there were lots of clinicians who were trying to maintain their kind of 2-week wait, like cancer pathways. And I had, we had so many calls in those first few weeks saying, oh, we've just moved to consent clinics or that kind of stuff, and trying to keep my kind of cancer operating up, but I now can't, we've moved to virtual consultations, but the one thing I need to do with the patient is that I need to sign this consent form and they need to sign this consent form. So a very kind of simple operational challenge that we were in a position where actually remote consent was one of those things that was on our radar. We'd always thought that it was something that we would do, but actually it wasn't in product in March 2020. But we'd built Concentric in a way that could allow us to do that. It was kind of a backlog item for us. It was pretty close on the roadmap, but we just hadn't done it. But those calls basically said, made it very clear to us that, right, we need to drop the couple of things that we were doing at the time, jump on that opportunity around remote consent, so that we could say to these clinicians, yeah, fine, like, let's find a way to like implement in a kind of light touch standalone way, but would allow you to have a virtual consultation and then send a consent information and for a patient to go through and give consent remotely, so that you didn't need to bring a patient in physically for that appointment, and equally you weren't then having to default back to a day of surgery consent situation, which there's still a lot of consent that's done on the day of surgery, and there's a kind of shift as part of digital consent to kind of move away from that. But lots of our conversations in those kind of March, April, May 2020 were those who had they just successfully moved away from day of surgery, were kind of proud to have done that, had seen the benefits of having those conversations early, and then were grappling with, okay, how do I not lose that once COVID kind of brought operational challenges. So yeah, that was the first one. That was kind of very obvious one that we were like, okay, we need to jump on this, and allow us to do it. And then the second one clearly was the very targeted funding around elective recovery, which there's definitely a group of 5 or 10 products which were highlighted as things that could support in kind of small ways to just get through a few more cases per list or whatever it is. So the main one of those for us is the data around reducing day of surgery delays by about 5%. So there's a decent amount of those kind of late starts for theatre lists that are to do with consent. There's there are a number of other reasons as well, but consent is one of them. And the data looks as if it's around 5% reduction in those day of surgery delays once you bring in a digital consent product. So that was the kind of justification for digital consent to be one of the products that was highlighted for funding as part of that elective recovery stuff. So those, it was those two things. I think that first one around remote consent allowed us to get beyond just Imperial. So then we kind of had about like 5 deployments that was basically laying the seed in different parts of the country, and then much more kind of solidly introduced with that funding, which just allowed us to accelerate not just into lots more trust, but much more at a trust-wide, like digital consent by default approach.
I see. That's really interesting to know, to be completely honest, and it shows just how capitalizing on one particular event or one particular thing goes a long way, and it might be the difference between whether your idea, your product actually makes it long term or it doesn't, as you mentioned as well. Because just if it were a week after or when lockdown was being introduced, it might have, their priorities might have shifted to something else, which is quite very interesting to see. Just moving on to another different tangent and kind of trying to find a bit of relatability with our viewers and our audience. What do you think would be necessary for med students or students in general to try to put a footstep into the tech or MedTech industry, and how did you develop those, and how do you recommend that students such as us go about sourcing opportunities and developing these type of things?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to state is that let's be really clear on the benefits of you as kind of students and early foundation trainees, and the benefits that the unique set of skills that you have there. So you are looking at systems fresh, you are coming in with a fresh pair of eyes. It's much harder once you've been in the system for 5 years to kind of just see the stuff. You just naturally accept things that in those like first few weeks of F1 will just jar you, will just like be like, why is that? Or your apprenticeship years, or your final years. So often you'll hear students say, oh, well, I'm just a med student, or like, introduce yourselves as just just a med student. But there are certain things that you will be able to do better as you're as a final year med student or a first year foundation doc, in terms of seeing the opportunities around innovation and seeing opportunities in those pathways far better than you will be able to do in 3 or 4 years. There are flip sides to that, of course. There are some things that actually you need the experience of pathways to kind of understand the context, and it's having the self-awareness to be able to come into the right place on that Dunning-Kruger curve to say, I have some benefits here that I can look afresh, and I'm not blind to some of the things that others might have become blind to, but equally not jumping in and saying, oh, I've seen this problem, I know exactly how to solve it, I'm right at that like first peak of Dunning-Kruger. And so having that awareness to kind of balance those two things, and then just I think playing with ideas is certainly the way I came into this, and I quite like that, because it allowed me to play with my own ideas, so it wasn't kind of going into another like company and kind of doing that stuff. I mean, in many ways that option kind of wasn't there in like 2012, 2013, just because there were far fewer MedTech, health tech startups like this. There's so many more that you could go into, so many more like clinical health tech jobs by now. Like you go to a job post, you can easily find health tech startups who are looking for clinicians. That basically that was not the case 10 years ago. So I'm not quite sure what I would have done in your situation now 10 years later. For me, it was much easier to play, explore, have the benefit of the time of that, of just kind of staying within the system, exploring something, playing. That was a many years of like tinkering and experimenting, and probably some of that was because there wasn't a more obvious like health tech pathway that existed. But I do think it stood us in good stead, allowed us to do lots of that kind of foundational thinking about like the way we were approaching this problem, without having to deliver revenue within 12 months, or like not run out of fundraising money that you've done, because there was none of that for years and years and years, right? I think you guys are fortunate in many ways. There's so many of the med schools have got MedTech foundations and societies, and so I'm kind of jealous of that in many ways, because those just again just didn't exist. So lean into those. There will be networks. Lots of those have existed for a number of for like 5, 6, 7 years by now. So there will be networks to leverage experience of people who've been through that. Lots of people in those medtech societies are now in various different health tech companies, or doing things in innovation within the NHS, or kind of entrepreneurship. So lots more experience to leverage. But I'll always come back to the idea of like playing with ideas. Like there's something quite nice about playing with your own ideas, thinking the foundational qualities of just saying, well, what would I do here? And often that's not one thing, right? I think I think I learned different things from various different things I played with within those first few years. And so not maybe worrying too much about saying like, this is the one thing, this is like the project that I'm going to do, but saying, okay, but let's explore that problem. Like, what does that look like? What could you do? What could you do in its like simplest form?
That's pretty interesting. And I just wanted to catch you while you were on the topic itself. So it is quite a unique experience to experiment with your own ideas and your own things to develop a vision that you had, or a vision that's slowly progressing, and that you can work on your own. But I guess my question is, considering that Concentric was developed for digital consent and stuff, did you ever think of maybe running the idea under another company, so as a branch of another company? And why did you think that? Because nowadays many people think that the only way to establish yourself is to create a new startup, create a new thing, rather than going and taking an idea to a different organization or working in a health tech organization itself. So why, what did you explore that idea of maybe doing it with someone, under someone, and then transitioning over, or was this generally the way that it was meant to be?
Yeah, and I think that there's different scenarios that work for different things, right? So in my case, actually, I did go to one of the other companies that kind of, in some ways, like the predecessor like model of consent, and said, like, I'm thinking about this thing kind of passionate. I've been playing around with it for a couple of years. Like, is it something that's on your radar? Is it something that we could work on together? So I did make a journey to, you know, the other side of the UK to kind of pitch that and see if that went anywhere, and it basically didn't, right? So yeah, the journey could have been quite different if that had happened, and there's definitely value in, you know, so our journey, the kind of middle bit was kind of interesting because so as the three co-founders, so myself, Ed, and Martin. So Martin's my brother, kind of CEO, CTO, is kind of techie background, software engineer for 20 years. But then Ed's, the kind of story between myself and Ed is interesting because Ed had also been like playing around with consent and in different ways at Imperial, taking a different approach. So I'd started this kind of aid memoir. Ed had started building a kind of e-form, kind of pretty straightforward e-form, but you know, did have some content, did have some stuff, but you'd kind of print it out and then sign this like templated form. And so we were introduced as part of the Just Clinical Entrepreneur program, as they kind of saying, well, this, you know, you guys are kind of working in the same space, why don't you have a chat? And so that was an example where, you know, for a number of months we were like, you know, are we like friends, foes, like enemy? Like, it's just like totally nonsense in hindsight, right? These were like two like surgical trainees, like, who'd been like tinkering with this like tiny stuff. Like, we were clearly much stronger building something together. So that was an example of two like individual like tiny projects coming and saying, well, can we build something together and like leverage like different approaches that we'd taken up until that point, and also leverage like different pathways going forward. So it was pretty clear from that point, so this was kind of 2015 2016, that I was leaning more by that point to saying, well, this could be a career for me, like health tech, be that concentric or something else. And Ed was going to stay in clinical practice but wanted to do some health tech stuff alongside, and I think that has worked out really well for us going forward. So Ed's a consultant breast surgeon down at Portsmouth, has allowed us to, you know, have a clinician, myself, who's like totally obsessed with product, like lives, breathes it, like full time, all that kind of stuff. And then Ed, who works clinically, can, you know, push back on us when we're straying a little bit too far away from the like reality of day-to-day life, and you know, bring those two things. And there's other strengths, right? So Ed's much more like research minded, did a PhD and a Darcy, like still runs most of the research activity. So there's those kind of balances. So yeah, so it's either, you know, doing something totally yourself, or it's going to someone who's doing you know, something similar or approaching the problem in, you know, not quite the same way, or kind of parallel product category, or it's finding others who are also seeing the same problem and coming together. But yeah, I think there are lots of people, you know, like I did at Bubble, right? I went into a different company, learned a huge amount from that experience. Wasn't for that period of time working on the product that I, you know, it wasn't my baby, as it was, in the same way Concentric is, but was still totally convinced while I was there that I was like building something that was valuable. It was kind of a load of work that we were doing around Rwanda that felt like really important, and so, you know, I think each of those pathways is like totally fair game, totally like reasonable things, but it depends on the context, right? So is there a product that, is there a company that could be interested in the idea? If so, fine. Or is it that you're interested in digital health and exploring and learning from the whole host of people who come into those companies? So, in these companies, you have people who have come from all sorts of backgrounds, be that like commercial backgrounds, like ops people, like people who are amazing at like running companies, and you learn from those people, but bring your like clinical expertise. And so it really depends. Like there are some people who have an idea, it's their baby, it's the thing they need to run with, and that might just not be on someone else's radar. And so in which case you just have to go with it. And there's other things that, I quite often have conversations with clinicians who are, or, people who are thinking about going into MedTech, and they, suggest, they mention an idea that you've got, and just by virtue of being in the industry for 10 years or so, I often find myself saying, oh, have you looked at X or Y that are kind of doing the same thing, or like pretty like similar, or that they're doing something that isn't quite the same, but I could well be interested in your like thoughts as a like extension. But there are some of those conversations actually I've had with people who have come and said, oh, I've got this idea for a thing, and then we've been like, oh, have you looked at these people who are kind of doing that stuff but in a different part of the country or whatever? And I know a couple of people who have ended up at those companies because they've said, they've gone to them, they said, I've been kind of thinking about this thing for a year, found out you like were 10 steps ahead of me on that journey, would love to join you on that, on that journey. And that's a lovely way that you're still working basically on your baby, but can accelerate some of that like business learning and can go into some structures, because frankly, coming in and trying to build a business as a junior doctor, there's a huge amount of things to kind of learn, and there's like huge business, huge learning curves for that. And for me, I think I'm so much better prepared to come and run and build a business because of those, particularly that Babylon experience, than if I hadn't had that as a stepping stone between.
So yeah, that brings up a really interesting point, where when you were establishing, you mentioned you met I think it's Mr. Edward St. John, isn't it? That you met in Imperial, and you guys were tweaking on two different ideas which were kind of subsets of each other, or overlapping quite a bit. How do you find people that are good to work with? Number one, you definitely can trust on an idea that's similar, but kind of you're expressing and you are really passionate about. How do you know that the other person is going to be passionate about it, going to put in the work, but at the same time not just there for, say, the money or the experience and just leave you halfway, something like that?
The old adage that a co-founder is there for longer than a marriage, right? So I think my reflection on that is that it's really easy to rush some of this stuff. So particularly in our example, where there were like different projects, there was no real like time frame thing that we absolutely had to kind of make a decision by to say like, was this like something we would work together? But there's often a kind of natural tendency to almost try and make this decision about whether you're going to like join forces, like almost like in one call. And for me, that just doesn't make sense, right? You don't decide to get married with someone after one Zoom call. Some might, but it doesn't often work out, right? And I think you have to approach it in that same way, because this is someone that you're going to have lots of the same challenges around, lots of the same like fundamental challenges and conversations around like approach and principles and like priorities. What are the really important things that you want to kind of do? And you just can't know that in a short period of time, because and so the other thing to work out is what are the right structures from a business perspective. So a really, really common like mistake that lots of people will do is say, okay, in our example, two like ideas, and so if we bring them together, like each person owns half of the two things. But like quite a common scenario in medicine is that you have, maybe like a technical founder, so who's coming in, and then a clinician, and the clinician might be staying on in clinical medicine, and so they might do like half a day a week on this idea, but actually the technical founder that's their role. They're doing it all, every day. They're doing it full time, and so you will often see places hit kind of challenges around, actually, we both own half of this business, but this like technical founder is doing it as their full-time job, but the clinician is doing it as like one day a week. So but there are good models around that. Most places by now will have like vesting arrangements. So you say, actually, depending on how much you're like inputting in terms of time or impact, if it's possible to work out in terms of impact, what relative impact. But vesting arrangements say, well, regardless of like how much input or how that changes over time, we have a model to think about like how much of this belongs to X or Y, and some, that's partly a kind of ownership of the business, and that's both financial but also decision making power. So it's often thought of as like, well, I own 50% of this business, and so that's like a financial thing, but actually it's also considering what does that mean practically in terms of like in 2 years, that one individual might have been doing it like full time, like knows the ins and outs of exactly kind of how every bit of things work, whereas that clinician might have ended up like tailing off. They were doing half a day for a year, but actually then they took some other role, and so they couldn't fit that into the job plan, and so there's weeks have gone by without them being involved. And so that's a pretty common scenario where founders teams struggle. And so having some advice of others who've been through that pathway, I think, is useful, just as a kind of hear the stories of people. But there are definitely good models that you can leverage to have the flexibility to work out like what's fair going forward, because no one knows what a startup is going to look like in 2 years time, like right at the start. So it's so hard to put like lines in the sand in terms of equity and all of that kind of stuff. So flexibility is important to make sure that can still like work and feel win-win to all of those individuals going forward.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think when you were saying before that, well, my question is more of like on a personal note, but obviously when you started Concentric Health, you'd been reading medicine for so long. So how was it then thinking about Concentric, actually having like the first clinical use, and then having to sort of switch your mind from thinking about medicine, clinical work, to learning about business, interacting with like your founders, having these in-depth conversations? How was that transition? And did you ever think, actually, I feel a bit out of my depth here? Or is that where your team members and like having your co-founders really helped?
Yeah, so there's clearly learning curve. So let's not minimize that learning curve. Definitely learning from others. So for example, Martin, my brother, one of the co-founders, so had been involved with a couple of other like startup businesses, so trod on a few of these paths, so could kind of sense check or kind of like course correct some things that instinctively we kind of jumped into or kind of weren't thinking about correctly. So that was definitely useful. But the other thing I think is, so I have one like really standout experience in terms of like transferable skills. So I went and spent a little bit of time in Boston, as part of MIT's like exec MBA, back when I was doing that leadership year. And I remember in one of those modules, it was this concept that MIT have around sense making. So in a business coming in, and the kind of context of this was more about like turnaround. So business, like, you know, bringing your business from a position of difficulty and like, you know, turning it around. But that, yeah, so we were learning about this concept of sense making, of kind of coming into a business and being able to take a step back, take time to like understand the context, understand the kind of politics with like a big P and small p of an organization before being able to kind of, you know, play that back to the organization and have some like, you know, suggestions or changes and that kind of stuff. And it was one of those groups where there was a few of us clinicians in that room, and when we went in, a total imposter syndrome, right? So these were people, so I remember I was in a group of 3, and I can't remember what one of them did, but the other was like chief operating officer of Givenchy, so like a huge global brand, right? So, and we were like sat in it, like on a table of 3, and I remember kind of they were talking about like some business like scenarios, and I was sat there being like I have like nothing to leverage here. I have nothing to talk about. But actually, like I gave some examples of you know, some scenarios from surgical training, and they were like, "Whoa, that's like so like amazing!" Like, and you're just like, "God, like I've just been listening to you, and I've been like, I have like literally nothing to compare to that." But I remember like getting to the end of that module and realizing that the clinicians in that room were by far the best at doing the stuff that we'd just been doing. So that was all about taking in a load of like information from lots of different kind of like people or parties or kind of different facets of information, understanding that, like synthesizing that, and then communicating it back in a kind of simple, straightforward way. And it was just one of those moments where you realize actually like that is what, as clinicians, you've literally spent the last 10 years doing, is like diagnostics, like diagnosing a problem, taking in the information you've got from lots of different places, bringing it back together, and then being able to communicate it in a simple way to whoever's in front of you, be that, you know, a child, an elderly patient, you know, a professor, you know, whoever that is, having a way to communicate that back to them. And you just realize that actually these, you know, big names in business were going on like a course where they were trying to be taught that in like a few days, and we'd spent years like honing that skill. And so that, you know, there are clearly other things and like transactional, like nitty gritty things that we won't know from a business perspective, but there are some like really big hitters that are totally transferable. So went into that group with like unbelievable imposter syndrome, came out of it being like, oh, maybe this isn't quite as clear cut of like, I don't know anything about this space.
That's really interesting and quite heartening to know that as much as we think that we don't have experience, it might actually be there, and just focusing on what you're doing might actually allow you to have conversations in improving your product or your service, whatever it is, slowly. So I guess my final question is, what's next for Concentric, and what's the journey that you envision yourself taking personally, as well as a company as well? Are you going to work more to develop on the product itself, or are you going to try to diversify as well and going to offering other services, other products?
Yeah, so we are kind of passionately focused. So we are definitely not going to be a company that gets a product to a place where it's kind of okay, but still got lots of things to do, and then move to the next thing. So one of my frustrations in health tech is that there is a lot of clinical software out there that is vaguely okay, but not quite like, not polished, doesn't make your heart sing, right? And that is definitely where we want to get to, is to get to a point where like this is totally our focus, that we're going totally deep in terms of like the vertical, rather than getting to a point and then kind of doing the next thing, even though we totally get asked to do things, right? So we get asked about, okay, well, you've done this bit, and then there's like research consent, or different types of consent, or different kind of bits that are just next to the consent pathway in like operational pathways. So we totally get asked for that stuff, and it's in many ways the kind of harder thing to say actually no, we're not going to do that. We're going to say no, we're focusing on this thing, so that we can get to a point where we can genuinely say like this works for like the vast majority of users, both clinicians and patients. Not everyone. You're never going to get to a point where like everyone loves the product. Like it's just never happened for anything. But getting to a point where actually the vast majority of people say, yeah, this totally works for me, and you can tell that it's been kind of led by clinicians who kind of understand this product, but has like real technical maturity, that it just works, just like it just supports, all the way through, and that they haven't got to a point where they can get away with going to the next product. So that's definitely, our approach in terms of like growth. So, we're still, I would say, still pretty much on that like steep growth curve in the UK. So, what are we? We're in 1 in 5 or so NHS trusts in England. That's happened over the last 2 years really, and so there's still a steep curve there for us, like in our kind of home market, as you'd say. Lots and lots of growth to be had in terms of Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, first deployment happening in the Republic of Ireland currently as well. And then it's about learning from some of those other places. So we're just starting to have deployments more than just kind of individuals or small clinics that we've always had dotted around the place, but actually kind of bigger deployments in, say, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And that for now is not really about revenue. It's more about like learning pathways, understanding what differences we might, may or may not need to do to this product into those other, markets. Partly so that we can make those things, but also partly because the more knowledge we have about that, the more we know about what flexibility we need to be building in while we're kind of building things, setting like technical structures for various different things, so that we don't get to a point where we say, okay, we've really got to a point where the UK is, basically got to a point where most people expect to be digital consent, and then go to Australia and suddenly it's like, oh, we need to be thinking about this totally differently. So if we can learn from those different markets so that we can build that flexibility in, then we can stay on the same path that we've had so far of saying, actually, this is a deployment, it's one code base, all the benefits that gives us around speed. So we generally, so we don't have any deployments of Concentric within hospitals. It's all cloud-based, communicates with the, with the local systems. But it means that we don't have to, have this little deployment and bit of code over here and then a completely different like version over here for the next door hospital. And so if we can stay on that path of saying, one code base with the flexibility that it needs, then we can continue to develop and be a true software company, spending most of our time focusing on like improving product, rather than spending most of our time configuring for different places, which is, unfortunately what most of these software companies, certainly like most of the EHRs, will spend the vast majority of their time doing configuration for different deployments, rather than actually, doing the things that clinicians want them to be doing to improving products, or, flexing to a new world of, remote, clinical medicine, virtual wards, all the kind of stuff that is changing. It's quite hard if you're spending all of your time doing like configuration, like things, tiny like bits that you need to do in different places to actually be able to also work on on the kind of improvement stuff.
I see. So with that question, that marks the end of the podcast. Thank you so much for talking to us today. This was incredibly insightful, especially for our listeners who are tuning in, learning about Concentric, learning how to set up and start in MedTech. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to us for more exciting and continued podcasts as well. And tune in next time for another exciting chat. Thank you.